I feel really comfortable with this methodology, but actually what I've been studying recently is how to apply it to existing businesses. Essentially, my objective today is to stretch your awareness. Some of the underlying concepts of Lean Startup and the Lean Startup framework go counter to many of established business norms, but hopefully in a good way and in a productive way. So the innovation elevator, I don't know whether anybody read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. So I was reading part of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator to my twin nephews at Christmas, and I just really like it. The idea about the Great Glass Elevator is it punches through the roof of the chocolate factory, and they start sort of flying around. So I think the challenge for many businesses is to work out what kind of trajectory they want to take. So some people want to scale, and some people are lifestyle businesses, and that's fine. But I think that in many ways, things, approaches like Lean Startup can help with scalability. Okay, so this is me. So this is just, I've just put some graphics on here. So I guess my background is a business consultant in the IT industry, but back in 96 to 98, I did an MBA at Cass Business School in the City University in London. Interestingly enough, I came across this guy, Henry Mintzberg, who says I'd get rid of all MBAs, which I thought was just quite nice and poignant here. So what was fascinating, when I did my MBA strategy, we did like a corporate strategy module, and this is all about scenario planning, 10-year plans, strategic planning, and everything kind of just, we know what's going to happen, all we need to do is execute. Henry Mintzberg talked about emergent strategy. And at the time, I thought, Henry, you're a great guy, but basically what I think you're saying is you just make it up as you go along. It took me about 3 or 4 years to realize that there was something more profound that he was saying. So my belief about what he was saying, or my reading of what he was saying, was that one's organization, if you're leading an organization, part of your job is to create an organization which is agile, which can sense the future, which does horizon scanning. But when you sense about what is going to happen, what you can do quickly is actually respond to that. More recent times, I took voluntary redundancy from Fujitsu, and in 2011-12, I worked with a startup business called Happiest. And Happiest is actually shut down now, as many startups do. But Bobby Patterson, the CEO, was fantastic in the sense that his background meant that when he came across Lean Startup, things started to make sense. So the biggest challenge that I observed when I was working as a sort of business analyst at Happiest was, how do you make the right decisions in a startup? And to be honest, I thought at the time that was a bit terrifying. It's like, how the hell do you make the right calls? Because everything is in play, there's so many moving parts. We felt, certainly, Bobby told me about Lean Startup, and he went to lots of courses, and I took it up as well. And I've been really interested because of, I guess, the things that we learned. Then I helped Bobby set up Search Camp this time last year, which is a startup accelerator program down in Middlesbrough. And I've also been involved with helping a lady called Emma Robinson set up Lean Northeast. So Lean Northeast is like a voluntary organization that puts on events, and I MC those events, and we do interviews with people from Silicon Valley to talk about Lean Startup. And it's just been great. We've been doing it a couple of years. So if you like, I'm passionate about this, but I'm also coming back to Henry Mintzberg more and more, reading a guy called Steve Blank, who we'll come on to in a second, and he's writing lots of blog posts about innovation in existing businesses, and I think he's on the cusp of really nailing it, actually. So in terms of a little bit of backstory, this was a guy called Yogi Lee. Lee Brindle was a guy who did some psychometric testing on me about 20 years ago. He's a lovely bloke. And he's big on yoga and mindfulness and stuff like that. And it was like really cool to look him up, because I'm big on that as well. But he did a couple of psychometric tests, and one was, Justin, you're really comfortable with intellectual ambiguity and uncertainty. But in terms of emotional uncertainty, you've got a little bit of work to go. So this has kind of been my journey over the last 20 years. At the moment, I'm reading this. This is a totally awesome book by a guy called Danny Kahneman. And he's describing something called behavioral economics. And essentially what he's saying is our decision-making, our gut, is usually total pants. I'll just leave it at that. Anti-fragile, so Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, which you may have heard about. Anti-fragile is about embracing the uncertainty of life and thriving on it. So it's actually queued up on my Amazon wish list, but I haven't got to it yet. But I've read I've listened to his podcast and watched a couple of videos. So if you like, my journey is how do I learn to thrive under uncertainty? So this is really awesome. So I was looking up Dwight Eisenhower. So he was in charge of like the Normandy landings, and it was like, I'm just thinking, yeah, that's quite a big gig actually. What I like about this is it's a perfect segue. Plans are worthless, planning is everything. Because I have a hypothesis that business plans for startup businesses and early stage businesses, and also in terms of innovation, business plans are a bit of a kiss of death. So the case study that Steve's written about says no business plan survives customer contact. So the case study talks about is a global satellite television service. And apparently they got investment of $5.2 billion up front. And then 11 years later, they came to market. But unfortunately, at the same time, the mobile phone revolution kicked off. And they hadn't really done anything to change the business plan in the meantime. And their projection was to have, I think, something like 42 million customers to break even. And they ended up with 30,000. At their peak, and what they did a couple of years after that was they actually sold the assets of the business of $25 million. So for me, that is an epic destruction of value. So, what happened was they did a business plan, they got some consultancies to write the business plan, to do some analysis, to do some projections, and basically they just executed the business plan, but what happened was it was an epic failure. So for me, my learning on that is flexibility is really important. To be able to adjust to what's happening in the outside world is incredibly important. So just whacking on really quickly, this is a few slides about an introduction to Lean Startup. So the key thing is it's about product development under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So that's applicable both for startup businesses, but it's also for anybody who's bringing a new product or service to market in an existing business, because essentially, unless you're doing a new brand of washing powder and you actually know what the market is, any new service is really uncertain. So it's how can we improve our chances of success, not only for that product, but maybe for the business as well? How can we do that more effectively? So hopefully the Lean Startup framework doesn't give answers, but it helps you make more effective decisions. Steve Blank, so startup is a scalable, repeatable, profitable business. It's a temporary organization designed to search for a scalable, repeatable, and profitable business model. So key things are search. Keywords are search, because you're searching for the business model. And it's also a business model rather than a business plan. So what Eric goes on to say is, so we can build stuff, but he's saying, should we do it? Can we build a sustainable business around this set of products and services? So part of the Lean Startup framework, using the business model canvas, is how do we turn a product into a business? So for me, this is about innovation, and it's also about product development. Okay, so I believe the plan, do, check, act cycle is lean methodology. Yeah. Okay, so how that is, so the interesting thing about that is lean methodology, I guess, is about continuous improvement. It's about learning continuously, but it's also about cycles. But then your continuous improvement is just that. You're continually improving in a cycle. In terms of Lean Startup, the lean in Lean Startup is Eric Ries's learnings about the lean methodology. It's about continuous improvement, and it's also about minimizing waste. Originally, Lean Startup is around digital, but more and more there are parallels with physical businesses. But essentially what he's talking about is build, measure, learn. So you want to build something, you want to measure its impact ideally on customers, on early stage customers, and then learn from that and keep going around, key point is continuous iteration and learning, and it's minimizing the total time through the loop. So what you're seeking to do is to build into the culture of the process of the business that you are continuously iterating, you're continuously testing things on people. It's based on the scientific method. So you have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you work out what that hypothesis is telling you, and then continually work with customers to hopefully find something that people want to buy. Okay, so for me, this is one of the key things that Steve Blank has written about, search versus execute. So we've already talked about a startup being a temporary organization which is searching for a scalable, repeatable, profitable business model. So what are we talking about is we've got search mode, and then once we find this scalable, repeatable, profitable business model, we then go into execution mode, which is essentially traditional business disciplines. But in the early stage, when you're working out what it is you're going to bring to market, what you're doing is you're in search mode. So I think one needs emotionally and intellectually the organization. All of the organization that you're working in needs to take that on board and needs to take that iterative idea, that approach on board. But I think it also applies to people like investors and the agencies that you're working with. If you've got investors who think that you're going to execute the business plan that they've asked you to put together, and then you start iterating, there's going to be a bit of a fallout. Because essentially your investors are expecting you to execute on the node business plan. But I would argue that for many people, you don't actually know what your business plan is because of a lot of optimistic projections, but also the stance of the business. Going back to Henry Mintzberg, I think the stance of most businesses should be about agility. It's like, what's happening? So classic examples are mobile phones, tablets, all sorts of stuff come along that get disrupted. Nokia apparently 7 years ago had 50% of the smartphone market, but now it has like 5% of the global market. And they've been disrupted. They've been cut off at the knees. So that's a large organization, but in terms of smaller organization, I think that these are still lessons that you can learn as well. So ideally what you're doing is you've got your concept, you've got your idea. You could do a little bit of early development, maybe come up with an MVP, test it on some real customers ideally, and then potentially launch it. But what you're seeking to do is you're seeking to engage with customers in an early stage to get feedback as early as possible, because essentially we want to find out what people want to buy. So 3 stages of a startup. So ideally what you're doing is you're talking to your customers to find out whether they have a problem that needs solving, that actually they will want to pay for. So problem solution fit is, yes, we've got a problem. So what you do as a provider is say, if we brought to market a product like this, would this be interesting to you? So essentially what you're seeking to do is get early stage customer feedback. The point about Lean Startup and the Lean Startup framework is to engage with your customers at the earliest stage possible in order to find out whether they will actually want to buy your product. Because if you spend a lot of time developing it, then when you bring it to market and you give it to them and they're not interested, then you've wasted time and you've wasted money and you've wasted your capital. So the challenge is, how do you sort of get over that bump? So if we go back here, so what I would do, I would call that customer development. So essentially what you're doing is you're doing a bit of customer discovery. So you're finding your customers. Ideally, your customers will be validating your idea. So what you're doing is ideally you're working out whether you've got problem solution fit. Do the customers actually want that? So what you're doing is you're doing customer discovery. You're finding your customers. Ideally, they'll validate what you're talking about, hopefully give you some feedback and say, well, actually, no, but if it did this, that would be really great. So these days you can use tools that will just allow you to mock up your website and show as like a fairly rough interactive design. But in a practical example, I worked on a government IT system, and the customer had like 500 requirements, but essentially what they wanted was they wanted us to show them something. They wanted to see something. They wanted to work out whether that was actually what they wanted, because they didn't really know what they wanted. A product market fit is when people will actually buy it. So once you've found a bunch of people who are really keen to buy your product, then ideally what you can do is you can go into scale, and then you can start executing on your business model, because what you've found is a way to make money from the product, but also customers who want to buy it. Okay, so in terms of some of the concepts, Eric will talk about the minimal viable product. Essentially, this is when you build, measure, learn, the build, you're bringing something to market, which is the minimal viable product, which Eric will talk about, minimizing the time to learning. Ideally, what you're doing is you've got a vision about what you want to achieve. And in terms of Dale's experience of testing with customers, it may be that people are saying, actually, that doesn't really work for us. So it could be that what you need to do in order to realize your vision is actually pivot to something different. How do you realize your vision in a different way? If you're innovating and you've got a new product, even in an existing business, I would argue some of the disciplines around lean startup are incredibly important, because if you're an execution business and you're used to executing, what you'll do is you'll take all the internal business metrics which you've set up for execution, but then you'll apply them to innovation. And if you're in search, essentially those metrics are going to kill your new products because you're still searching. The point about search for me is what you're doing is you're changing the way that you have a discussion with the rest of the business. If the rest of the business, the people in charge, if your chief operating officer is saying, we've just got to execute, that's arguably going to kill your new products, because you're measuring them against some objectives or financial criteria that are going to make it really difficult to succeed. User experience design. Does everybody know what user experience design is? Okay, so Apple is a classic example of nailing the user experience. So I have an Android phone, and I think it's pretty good. But before that, when I was working at Happiest, I had an iPhone. So I had iTunes on the PC. I connected the iPhone to the PC, and I'm a big fan of podcasts. And I would subscribe to podcasts through iTunes, and actually it was all pretty straightforward, and I didn't really think about it. Then when I moved to Android, it was like, how do I do the same thing that I used to do with iTunes and my iPhone to download podcasts, because it doesn't work. And I got quite a sore forehead because there's quite a lot of bashing my head against a brick wall. But the point about user experience is that, okay, so if Arthur C. Clarke said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, any technology that is accepted becomes part of the furniture and you forget it, you just use it. So mobile phones, for instance, it just becomes part of your life. Your lifestyle changes because actually you can be more spontaneous. So the thing about Apple that Apple has done amazingly well is to nail the user experience. It just becomes really easy. So my mum, bless her, she has an iPad, she has an iPhone, and you just connect it all together, it works. But most people are non-tech, and the user experience, people buy things because the user experience is great. It's just easy to use. So that's what user experiences is. That's what it is, I guess, just from a high-level perspective. Oftentimes, it's mentioned in conjunction with websites and the usability of websites. So there are people who are called user experience designers, and what they will do is they will think through how people are going to use the website in order to create the most effective experience, the most seamless, sort of friction-free experience so that people can get stuff done. I understand from reading Jeff's book that user experience people are very detail-oriented, and what they'll do is they'll get a brief and they'll go away for maybe a month or so and design something and come back and say, look at this, isn't it really great? So forgive me, I'm using a bit of poetic license here, but the idea about lean UX is that instead of everything having to be perfect and the design having to be perfect, actually the focus is on what the customers want. So when I worked at Happiest, we had a fantastic designer and our product looked amazing and it looked really great. But actually our CEO let him go because he felt that the design was getting in the way of usability and actually on the focus, which was trying to build a product that people would use and also, more importantly, that people would actually pay for. So the thing is, if you've got a fantastic design, but it is not functional in the sense that people won't use it or they won't pay for it, then as a business, basically, it's not serving you. So lean UX, the idea about lean UX is just build, measure, learn. It's what can you get together in terms of an MVP, in terms of the design? What can you put out that's good enough to get some feedback? And how do you change the user experience design and creation process so that it becomes an iterative process, build, measure, learn, rather than just going away and having all the pixels perfect? It's how do you create a sort of minimal viable product, but in terms of user experience design, so that you can then start iterating, get customer feedback, and build something that people want rather than what you think is really great.